Greetings everyone, I am Syed Ali Jafri and I welcome you to another episode of the CSPR webinar series which aims to bring to you quality discussions on strategic, security and foreign policy issues. In his 1983 article entitled The Bishops and the Bomb, former US National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy argued, as long as each side has thermonuclear weapons that could be used against the opponent even after the strongest possible preemptive attack, existential deterrence is strong and it rests on uncertainty about what could happen. These words were the building blocks of what we call existential deterrence. Bundy made these assertions more than 2 decades after partaking in the perilous Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day episode that brought the world on the precipice. Even after 63 years, we still don't know as to what saved the day during the crisis. That being said, the crisis is cited as an exemplar of nuclear risks, uncertainties, and dangers, and somewhat calls into question the robustness of existential deterrence. Since then, there has been many an instance where the prospect of nuclear use was high. Mercifully, nuclear weapons have not been used, something which has compelled scholars to delve into the reasons behind nuclear non use, not least against non nuclear states. The ongoing war in Ukraine and its nuclear undertones have also driven scholarship on this aspect. Recently, Dr. Ulrich Kühn navigated informational lacunae to explain Russia's nuclear non use in one of the most critical phases of the Ukraine war. As both the situation in Ukraine and the nuclear order become messier, we thought it would be good to have Dr. Kuhn discuss his new article. A few words about Dr. Kuhn. He's the head of the research area Arms Control and Emerging Technologies at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. He's also a non-resident scholar of the Nuclear Policy Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a co-convener of the research network on Rethinking Nuclear Deterrence hosted by the Harvard Belfer Center. He previously worked for the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, uh, Helmut Schmidt University, and the Federal Foreign Office. From 2016 to 2017, he was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Uh, Kuhn works at the intersection between security studies and conflict research. His research focuses on arms control and non-proliferation mechanisms, the nuclear and conventional deterrence, Euro-Atlantic and European security, and international security institutions in concrete terms. He researches nuclear policies, security mechanisms between NATO and Russia, conventional arms control in Europe, foreign and security policy of Germany, the United States, and Russia, and confidence and security building measures of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's the author of Germany and Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, Atomic Zeitenwende. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Dr. Kuhn. It is always a pleasure to read your work and to listen to your thoughts on a number of issues that the world faces, especially in the realm of nuclear politics and security. You recently authored a fantastic article on um, Russia's non-use of nuclear arms in the fall crisis of the war in Ukraine in 2022. And you looked at a number of causes as to why Russia did not, despite giving uh, threats, use nuclear weapons. For the benefit of our audience, could you just summarize the findings of your article and then we could have a discussion after that?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be on that show. I'm a regular listener to the podcast, and I'm really happy to be here and discuss this article of mine that I published. I think very early this year. We finished it up last year in December, and I think it was published in early January 2025 in the journal Defense and Security Analysis, which, by the way, is run by someone TD McDonald, who sits close to where you sit in Monterey. I think he is also with the Naval Postgraduate School. So shout out to him. He's a great editor and has done a fantastic job shepherding that article. So let me start by going a bit into the question of what triggered my interest. So clearly, over the last 3 years, we have seen a tremendous revival of public nuclear threats coming from Russia, and on a scale that we haven't seen since decades, and perhaps in its condensed form, never ever, I would say. So that's clearly something that has left a huge imprint on the public in the northern and western hemisphere. But I think it was recognized all over the world. And perhaps the most important episode during those last 3 years, of course, I forgot to mention, but I think it's obvious, all these Russian nuclear threats came in conjunction with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, its neighbor. And the most perhaps important episode happened during the fall of 2022. So let's perhaps recollect for a second what happens in 2022. In February, the Russians invade Ukraine. Most observers, I would say, were still not believing that the Russians would invade Ukraine up until the very end, when they actually did. So they do invade Ukraine. First, many observers think that the Ukrainian defense will collapse within days or weeks, but that's not happening. The Ukrainians push back. After a couple of months, they managed to shift the tide, push back the Russians. And when we enter the fall, that is September of 2022, it becomes clear that the Russian so-called special military operation, which is a fantastic way of saying we attacked our neighbor, our peaceful neighbor. So this special military operation runs into problems, like serious problems. The Ukrainians are pushing back. The Russian forces are retreating in eastern Ukraine. And suddenly we hear again Russian nuclear threats, quite clear, to be honest, at least at the rhetorical level. But what we do hear now is the US administration going public. President Joe Biden, his security advisor, and the message is that we're in a nuclear crisis. The Russians are considering nuclear use. And then, a couple of weeks later, around early mid-November, this all dies down. The Russians have not used nuclear weapons. The nuclear rhetoric kind of dissipates. It comes back after a while, after a couple of months, but it seems like there was no real nuclear crisis, or was there? And then last year, a famous US journalist, Bob Woodward, publishes a book. It's called simply War. And he there reports that the US intelligence community in the fall of 2022 had assessed that the chances of Russia using nuclear weapons against Ukraine had risen during the fall to 50%. And that's incredible, because I remember that back in the fall, I was asked by some journalists, what do you think? What are the chances that the Russians are using nuclear weapons? And I would always abstain from saying a clear number or a figure, I would always say, it's not zero because the Russians have nuclear weapons and they have threatened nuclear use. But I cannot tell you an exact figure. But, when I would talk in private, I would say something like, I think it could be something around 5%. So hearing in hindsight that the US intelligence community assessed it was 10 times that, it was 50%, I was shocked. And that was the time when I thought it's really, really time to sit down and think about it and try to approach it. Now, writing this article, I ran into one big problem, and that is it was obvious from the very beginning there was no smoking gun. I would not uncover the hidden document or I don't know, a recording or someone, anonymous from, I don't know, some intelligence community saying, yes, there was, we had taped this one phone call with a field commander from the Russians and, clear evidence. They wanted to use nuclear weapons. So the point was, it was obvious that there was a nuclear crisis going on in the fall, meaning in those 2.5 months, September, October, bit of November in 2022, but it was not clear or I could never present any real evidence. So I would basically investigate something from which I would know at the beginning that I would have to treat it as if possibly it never happened. Maybe the US was hallucinating. Maybe US intelligence was wrong. Maybe the Russians never considered using nuclear weapons. By the way, that's one line of arguments that pundits had taken back then, saying the West is just afraid. The Russians never considered nuclear use. Might be, but the point is we don't know. So I thought, okay, how am I gonna get to that point to say at least something? Because I think it's necessary that we start focusing on this thing, and maybe the real research will be done in 20 or 30 years, perhaps once the Russians open their archives. But we have to approach this issue also now. There has to be a way. So what I did was that I basically looked at what's the literature out there on non-use. What are the explanations that we know, that we have from 60, 70 years of scholarship on nuclear weapons? And then let's compare it to at least what is publicly available about these couple of weeks. And I did that, and I ended up looking at various schools from the nuclear field. I looked at rationalist explanations. I looked at normative explanations. I looked at institutionalist theories of non-use. And, there are concepts out there that most nuclear scholars know. There is an international taboo not to use nuclear arms or a tradition. There are deterrence threats that should prevent states from using nuclear weapons. There is the question of military practicality, like does it make sense to use these weapons? There are reputational considerations. And there are arms control measures that should prevent at least the unwanted use of nuclear weapons. And I compared all those, and I found out that most of those theoretical explanations can, to some degree, explain what we've seen in the fall crisis of 2022. It's clear that the US had used deterrence threats towards the Russians publicly as well as privately. The latter we know from the book of Bob Woodward and reporting about his book. And there is also an interesting correlation. I'm not saying it's a causation, I'm saying it's a correlation because, again, I cannot prove anything. But the US had worked in tandem with a lot of allies and partners to get countries on board that had so far chosen to abstain from taking a clear line, like India or China. They would not condemn the Russians for their actions, but they would also not clearly support the Russians. And those countries, they experienced a lot of diplomatic pressure from the United States and allies of the United States, basically urging them to publicly come out or privately come out to the Russians and say, guys, you cannot use nuclear weapons. It's a taboo. You cannot do it. So I would call that taboo reinforcing diplomacy, and that was quite successful. And all that culminates in the so-called Bali statement of the G20, which includes, by the way, Russia, and that was in November. And in that statement, it clearly says all these 20 powerful states, they all agree that nuclear threats and the use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. You shouldn't do it. And the interesting thing is, after this statement, the Russian nuclear threats just disappear, like from one day to another. That's interesting. I'm inclined to say there is at least a correlation. I think that made an impression on the Russian leadership, because Russia, some might not believe it, but they do care about their international reputation and standing. They just don't care so much what some states, for instance, in Europe think, but they do care what the governments in New Delhi or in Beijing think. And I think that this was really an important practice that we saw from the US government and their allies in that regard. And that allowed me in the end, towards the end of the article, to build something that I call a multi-causal model of non-use in the fall crisis of 2022. And I list basically 5 factors, that is deterrence threats, taboo confirming statements, manipulation of reputational concerns, arms control cooperation, as well as low military practicality. All those 5 are in place. Yes, they were in place, and they helped shape, I'm convinced, I cannot prove, but I'm convinced, they helped shape Russia's opinion, the opinion of the Russian leadership, and may have helped to prevent Russian use against Ukraine. Having said that, this article, I believe, is only the starting point of a long research investigation into what happened in 2022. You mentioned at the beginning in your intro the Cuban Missile Crisis. In a way, this crisis was nothing like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in a way it was a bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we do certain factors here again at play. What we haven't seen publicly, for instance, and that is something where I think future research has to get into, what we haven't seen publicly is reassurance. From the Cuban Missile Crisis, we now know that the US government gave the Soviets reassurance in the form of promising them to withdraw their nuclear arms from Turkey. That was not known back then during in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that was important for the Soviets to change their stance. There is rumor out there that the US government in the fall crisis of 2022 again reassured the Russians in conjunction with battlefield developments around the Ukrainian city of Kherson. We don't know that yet, but I think things will come out in that regard, and we will learn more about this episode, which I think personally was the biggest nuclear crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for giving this rundown, which I think raises a number of questions. So I've always enjoyed and liked quoting Francis Gavin's work when it comes to looking back at things, and he has always said it is difficult to write about something that has not happened. So kudos to you for making the effort, and that too a year after the crisis took place. And you also mention his chapter in Hal Brand's new book on the Russo-Ukraine war, in which he said we don't know much about what happened. But the good thing that you did was that you said it cuts both ways. If we don't know enough about Russia dishing out nuclear threats, then we don't know much about the other side of the equation. So I think that this intellectual effort on your part is really important and at the same time a tad brave. So kudos to you for that. Now, a lot of other questions. I would like to push back on one thing. I think um India and Pakistan were embroiled in a very dangerous crisis in 2019, Feb 2019. We just marked the sixth anniversary of that, and I hosted a webinar on the emotional dynamics of nuclear crises featuring Dr. Nicholas Wheeler. Um, and I think that crisis was, based on the current information we have, a lot more dangerous because now it's clear that when the crisis was at its peak, India conveyed to Pakistan that it has locked six targets, which it will hit through missiles. And Pakistan then said we have locked 18 targets. And as you know, right now we don't have any mechanism to ascertain as to whether an incoming missile is armed with a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. And the flight time between India and Pakistan is 6 to 8 minutes. So I think that was a a really dangerous crisis, and you never know how the cycle of escalation could go. You can have round one, you can start round one, but round two you just can't predict how round two will play, and then round three and round four. So so that's so
But can I quickly comment on that?
yes.
You're totally right. So that's my personal ignorance, being totally in this U.S. Soviet / U.S. Russia mindset. You're right. What you described, and I had read about the crisis before, was um, perhaps much more dangerous. It was clearly more dangerous in the sense that you had two nuclear armed powers at each other's throats. And I would say we did not directly have that in the fall crisis because the threat, if there was a threat, was not against the US. It was not even against a US ally because Ukraine is not a US ally. Plus, we had a reaction from the US side that, as far as we know, deliberately excluded the nuclear option. But you're right about the tit for tat. We don't know whether a non-nuclear option in response to a nuclear option means that it stops there. That might just be the beginning of the next round of tit for tat. But you're right also with one important point, and that is for the fall crisis, we have not seen this material evidence. What you pointed to, this clear, we have locked 6 targets, yeah, but we locked 18 targets. That's something that we're missing. I don't know whether we can ever uncover that because there has to be a reason for the US intelligence community to say something like 50%. I mean, that can't be just chatter from a local commanders, I don't know, saying over a cigarette and 100 gram of vodka, these kind of glasses of 100 milliliters saying, oh, we might use nuclear weapons in a day or two. That's not, credible enough for me to say, okay, we have to talk to the president, Mr. President, we have to go to 50% in our assessment. So there has to be something there, but you're right. This we're still lacking.
Be it 5 or 50, when it comes to nuclear weapons, that difference is moot. Even a 1% likelihood of a nuclear use is colossal. Like, for example, when we talk about deterrence, if 99% cases are a success and 1% is a failure, then that's curtains. So since you talked about deterrence at the very beginning, so we often hear this term with reference to the Russo-Ukrainian war. We get to hear that deterrence failed or deterrence did not succeed, and I probably do not agree with this framing, because deterrence, we need to look at what and the hows, the what's and the hows of deterrence. If we want to look at um, the Russo US equation, deterrence is succeeding because both have not used anything against each other, and both have not had a have had a have had a confrontation, um, and, and NATO has not used nuclear weapons, as you rightly point out in your article, against Russia or against Russian troops in Ukraine. So how do you look at this framing with regard to deterrence in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war? How do you read deterrence, success, and failure in this context?
Oh my God, Ali, that's a that's a tough question, because this is the kind of question that people have wrestled over for a month, or perhaps for the last 3 years, I would even argue. Even today, you will hear people that say, with where we are today, with Trump and Zelensky and Ukraine, we wouldn't be there if Biden wouldn't have been so timid, which in a way is already implying that he had given in, or he was deterred. I think a couple of observations from me. The first observation is that we might have mislearned or unlearned in the West what it feels like to be deterred. That's the first thing. Because many of the issues at hand, thinking about, shall we provide the Ukrainians with real battle tanks, modern battle tanks, and have a discussion about that amongst allies over weeks and months before coming to a decision and making sure the Americans are on board and whatnot and whatnot. That's the logical outcome of being deterred by the Russian nuclear threats. This is what deterrence feels like on the receiving end. And this is what it feels like for the Russians to also be on the receiving end when they feel like certain things they cannot do. They cannot, target the facilities in Poland that are just a couple of kilometers on the other side of the Ukrainian border, where all these nice American, wonderful new types of equipment are, or used to be, like Patriot and whatnot. So the funny thing is, if you look into the Russian expert landscape, you see almost the same. It's like a mirror image. They're very unhappy with how deterrence works. That's why we had this large so-called Karaganov debate in Moscow. How can we change? How can we change the cause of the war? Why are our nuclear threats, why are they not more successful? So almost the same debate that we had in the West. So that's one observation. And the second observation is that I think we have to differentiate a little bit about what the Russians were doing. There is a clear deterrence threat from the Russian side in the sense of, do not even dare to attack our forces. Do not dare to take this war to Russian soil. Directed at NATO and at NATO, right? That's a clear deterrence threat, and I would say it's a typical, which is typical for deterrence, is a defensive threat. However, at the same time, the Russians tried to have also a compellence threat, which was offensive, and that's the threat of, do not stand in our way, meaning do not interfere, do not support the Ukrainians, do not send them weapons, do not give them military intelligence support, do not dare to put sanctions on us and whatnot. So I would argue in terms of the deterrence threats, as you said, Russia was successful. NATO did not attack Russia. Russia did not attack NATO. When it comes to the compellence threats, I would say a mixed bag. Some of those compellence threats made the West very hesitant and made the West move slowly. That is what Janice Gross-Stein in her fabulous, still I would say best scholarly article so far on the Russo-Ukrainian war and the Texas National Security Review call, the Schellingian salami slicing tactic, or boiling the frog, moving slowly, pushing the boundaries slowly, like you're blind or like you're in a dark room where you don't know what is next. You have to move slowly. In that regard, I would say the Russians were successful, but all over, come on. The Ukrainians received all this equipment despite the Russian nuclear threats. They received, up until yesterday, intelligence support. They received a lot of financial support, and the West cut off most of its or many of its economic ties to Russia. So a mixed bag.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. And I think in your article, you do a good job of drawing this distinction between compellent and deterrent threats that were dished out. And obviously, this takes us back to the scholarship on the coercive value, the net coercive value of nuclear weapons. And you also mentioned Furman and Shasher's work in great detail in your article. Um, uh, there is also this one important factor that you talked about, that you delve into in your article, reputational cost, and you obviously cite Schelling, who did a lot of work on this idea. Uh, Obviously, Putin wants to have a certain kind of a reputation, and so does the United States. So reputations always matter, but uh, uh, I'm not sure if non-used in today's context. I'm not sure whether or not Putin is concerned about his reputation, and whether reputational costs could deter him from drawing first blood. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I alluded to it at the beginning. I look, it's there are two stories here. The one story is Putin, the bloody butcher, going against his peaceful neighbor, attacking civil centers in cities, bombing hospitals. Doing the same, by the way, over and over again since decades in Syria, in Chechnya, with a short war against against Georgia. How and why should that man care about any kind of reputation? I mean, as long as he's safe domestically, and as long as he is safe behind his huge nuclear arsenal, why should he care? But then you see how this person almost frantically is trying to sell to his domestic audience and to himself and to others that he's not isolated. No, he's not isolated. He has all these BRICS countries, the five and the BRICS partner nations, and he can go to China and he can interact with Kim Jong-un, and it's almost an alliance with those countries and the Iranians. So come on, don't tell me like his standing does not matter to him. I would say it does. We have to differentiate between the audiences. It's not the international community. He cares much less about what people think here in Hamburg, where I sit, or in Berlin, or in Barcelona, or Paris, or Ottawa, or perhaps New York and Washington, though I think the US is a special case when it comes to Russia. But he does care what people think in Beijing and in Nanjing and in Delhi. As well as in a couple of other important powers in the global south, also, for instance, including Brazil. So I would be careful to totally discount it and portray him as the ruthless dictator that in fact he is, but that does not care about what anyone thinks. He does care about, and he does his calculation. And if he does something that runs completely against the interest of the Chinese, for instance, then they will tell him, and believe it or not, he will think about what they're saying. He might not come to the conclusions that he is just the little lapdog of the Chinese and then follow suit. For that, he is too convinced that Russia is a great power, but he will take into account what they tell him.
Yeah, of course. The audiences do matter, and gone are the days when there was a Soviet-Sino split. Now, of course, given Russia's bid to reconnect with the East, the Eastern Eurasian Economic Union, and all those things, I think um, there's a lot of practical sense in, so to speak, pandering to China, given its economic ascendancy in the wider region. Um, Now let's talk about the taboo. Um, for the taboo to be strengthened, we need to engage in taboo talks. Taboo talks are important, but statements, uh, threatening statements, even if they don't explicitly involve the nuclear word, those are quite repugnant to the development of to the taboo and the norm of nuclear non-use. Uh, you have gone over some statements in your article, but your overall impression. What is your overall impression about uh, the language surrounding nuclear weapons uh, ever since the start of the Ukraine war? Because I think the language has leaders have become a tad more careless when it comes to talking about nuclear weapons, and it is not it. I think that even predates this war. We saw statements from President Trump, the fire and fury statement, or statement which said that I will destroy the Iranian civilization, or statements from our part of the world, India and Pakistan, like we have not kept these nuclear weapons as firecrackers for our um, as festivals. So, what's your overall take on the language surrounding nuclear weapons? Because what leaders say about nuclear weapons really matters.
Yeah, I agree. The short answer is I'm concerned, and I'm increasingly concerned, because the language may, in a way, foreshadow what comes later, and it tells us a little bit about the state of the taboo. I mean, as long as nuclear weapons are not used, you can say the taboo works. Okay, fine. But you just mentioned it. This is not just Putin. This is not just the Russians. This started earlier. You mentioned fire and fury. There was, my button is bigger than yours and all that stuff. Childish, it may seem from the outset, but still, nevertheless, this is bragging about nuclear prowess, which we thought world leaders should not do, should not engage in, or just really crazy ones. But yeah, that has increased since a couple of years. There is tremendous work has been done over the last 10 years or so on so-called norm contestation. That is long-standing norms. How are they being undermined? By what kinds of acts, and particularly speech acts, by powerful leaders, nation states matter. They do matter, and you always, after a contestation, need someone who pulls back and says, "No, no, the taboo is not weakened. It's in place. This norm is still here, and we stand up to it." That's why I said that I was encouraged, not discouraged, but encouraged by the reaction that was shown by a couple of states. I mentioned in my article the German chancellor, who his Ukraine policy, he was domestically trashed over years by pundits, think tankers, and the media. Worst chancellor ever. He's weak and he's a wimp and he's afraid of the Russians. But you know, his role there also in the fall crisis, I think, was important. It was important that we got these statements from Xi Jinping, from Modi, from the Indian Minister of Defense, and all that, again, as I said, culminating in the G20 statement, which was reinforcing the taboo. But yes, overall, after 3 years, by the way, the Russian rhetoric came back. I think we will hear a lot of nuclear rhetoric in 2025, as soon as it turns out that Donald Trump's brilliant plan to bring the Russians and the Ukrainian together to a table for a beautiful peace deal will not materialize. Then we will hear more nuclear threats, and this time they may even come again from the White House. So this is all not good. It shows us that this is a prolonged period now, and I don't know if all the big powers engage in that talk, who are then the responsible powers internationally that others will listen to?
Thank you so much. I really think so. Just before the war, the some big powers like the uh, Russia, China, the US, they reiterated their calls that nuclear weapons, nuclear wars can never be won. Thus, they must never be fought. I think we need statements like this again, and with a renewed commitment to not using nuclear weapons. I know when the push comes to shove, things could change, but these statements obviously have an important symbolic and normative value. Um, they contribute to in strengthening the norm against norm and tradition and taboo against nuclear use. So these we
Absolutely,
we
absolutely.
cannot discount the importance of these. Absolutely. So
Words matter. Look, I mean, language is one of the fabrics that we use to connect with each other. So yeah,
absolutely,
that matters big time.
absolutely. So I have my last two questions pertaining to two of the things that you um, discussed in your article. So you looked at Snyder's stability instability paradox, uh, and since you work on emerging tech and EDTs and their implications on strategic stability, so I'm reminded of a very important paper by Rebecca Hersman. She gave this idea of wormhole escalation way back in 2020, uh, and she talked about gray zone tactics at the subconventional level, which have the propensity to have strategic effects. So obviously, the instability part of the paradox has become more unstable, but the stability part of the paradox is also becoming unstable. So we are, in my opinion, coming to the point of terming this situation as the instability, no paradox. So the stability at the highest end of the conflict spectrum is uh, is no longer that strong, because emerging technologies, disruptive technologies, they all uh, are likely, in more ways than one, to erode to erode that stability. So, what's your take on emerging the implications of emerging and disruptive technologies on strategic stability between nuclear dyads and yeah, otherwise?
Well, first of all, I think we don't even have to go there and say it's the emerging technologies that may lead at one point us to cross the nuclear threshold. Um, just go back to the crisis. We talked about it. We know that from reporting, the US side conveyed the message to the Russians: we know what you're doing or what you're contemplating. We know it. Don't do it. And by the way, if you do it, we will hit back hard. We'll probably not use nuclear weapons, but it's going to hurt you so much. And we talked about this in this podcast at the very beginning, I think, that if that would have played out, why would that be the last round of escalation? Like, who tells us that the Russians would be like, okay, so we used a nuclear weapon or two against the Ukrainians, I don't know, to make a statement that they shouldn't move further east. So the Americans now have taken out a couple of our strategic assets using conventional precision strike weapons. That's bad. All right, let's leave it here. Goodbye. That's it. Or wouldn't they use at least the same kinds of weapons, which they have, to target a couple of valuable targets in Europe or perhaps in the US? And who tells us that this then would not, after having already crossed the nuclear threshold at the beginning, then going back to the conventional level, wouldn't then go back to the nuclear level? No one knows. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I find it kind of artificial to assume that these domains will ultimately, in a crisis, remain separate. And that's something that also Thomas Schelling told us in the past, that we should not assume that, and we cannot know for certain. Yes, certain emerging technologies might make it deliberately or inadvertently more likely that in a crisis we may cross the nuclear threshold. But what I'm saying is that we wouldn't even need most of those, or we shouldn't assume that just because we have a couple of impactful emerging and disruptive technologies, that because of that, the crossing the threshold becomes easier. It might simply happen because it's a war, and that applies, for instance, to a potential war between the US and China over Taiwan. And there is great work done there by Taylor Fravel and others, Hendrik Heim, that is looking exactly at these issues and at the interconnectedness or the entanglement, like James Acton calls it, between the conventional and the nuclear domain.
Thank you so much. And I would add to that list Tongza, who has done a lot of compelling work on Chinese nuclear policy. He was here with me on this podcast, and we delved into the political aspects of China's nuclear modernization and how if we want to reach arms control agreements between China and the US, I think the politics should be at the heart of it all. Um,
Can I,
so
can I just quickly, well, let me quickly add one thing, because when you mentioned Snyder and stability, instability, one thing that came back immediately, and that was one of the strongest feelings that I had at the beginning of the war. Because look, I'm here in Europe, I'm in Hamburg, not that far away from Ukraine. Hamburg has taken in a couple of thousand Ukrainian refugees. Here in my research program, two Ukrainians are working since the beginning of the war. One of them has her kid in the same kindergarten as we do. So we're close to all that. And so that also increases the emotional connectivity one has to the matter at hand. And by the way, that's one of the big differences to a lot of the crises that we've seen throughout the Cold War, where it was what was then called back then the
Fulda Gap.
third, and also it was just it wasn't called the Global South, it was called the Third World, and far away in Vietnam and Angola and always far away. Now it's right at our doorstep. So one of the things that really made an impression on me was, despite this bloody war and the pictures that we could see every day, how safe we were and still are in NATO countries, and the Russians in Russia. That was before Kursk. And how deeply unjust this system is that we built. There is this country that gave up nuclear weapons. I know they were never Ukrainian nuclear weapons, but still, they gave up nuclear weapons. And below the safety of the nuclear stability, a war is raging every day. And the others are active, but active spectators that are safe. This does not bode well in terms of lessons for other countries to take in.
Yeah, absolutely. As Dr. Mariana Bujarin says, the demand for deterrence has obviously increased. If you look at Ukraine's case. So my absolute last question to you is related to something that you have worked on over the past couple of years: behavioral arms control. In your article, you rightly say that arms control is the least um, important factor that contributed to Russia's nuclear non-use in the crisis. Uh, but the question now is that arms control, as you also alluded to in your article, is ruptured. It's like it's not working. Arms control, the architecture has been eviscerated, especially since 2018. How do we revamp that? Would behavioral arms control be the right fit to look at to reduce nuclear risks? Although I have a very different take on nuclear risk reduction, but that's for another day, another conversation. But how do you look at, so for our readers, for our audience, just tell us, what do you mean by behavioral arms control, and how in this current scenario can it help?
So thank you. That actually warrants its own talk. Behavioral arms control is a concept that I developed together with my good friend Heather Williams, the head of Pony at CSIS, and it developed basically out of a large frustration that the two of us share about what is called the crisis of arms control, which is going on basically since 25, some would even say 30 years now, and a crisis that has increased in terms of severity and frequency over the last couple of years, up to a point where today we're basically at a point where there is no real functioning arms control, for instance, between the Russians and the Americans, but also between Russia and NATO, and where are other arms control mechanisms. And I like to think about arms control in a broader sense. So I subsume, for instance, the NPT under it, where these are the last bulwarks, the NPT, CTBT, but they're clearly under threat. So could focusing on behavior, certain behaviors where you say, look, this is common knowledge even amongst adversarial states that this is the kind of behavior you don't want to see, like blinding your satellites that you use for command and control missions, just like that. That you shouldn't do that, or cyber attacks on your NC3 systems. That's off limits. You should never engage in that. Would it help if we focus on these kinds of behaviors, basically norms, and try to strengthen these norms and stigmatize other behavior where we or reward other behavior where we think this is good behavior? Yeah, I still think that's an approach worth pursuing, because it's clear we're not in the Cold War world where we find where first of all we have just two superpowers at the table that then agree on neatly drafted treaties with treaty language and verification protocols and mechanisms and all that good institutional stuff that gave rise to or supported regime theory in the 1970s and 80s. We're not going to see that again, at least not for the time being. Might come back at some point, but not for the time being. So maybe we should look for a lighter form of arms control. To be honest, I still believe in the approach, but one has to be clear, right? At the moment, it's clear the United States is not on a track where they want to do serious arms control. I know we have seen this push from Donald Trump on arms control with Russia, but I think it would be really bad if we see this kind of arms control that comes on the back of betraying Ukraine and US allies in Europe. So that's one point to take into consideration. And the other point is that in this triangle between China, Russia, and the United States, reinforced by, you mentioned it, a new generation of destabilizing new technologies. I just don't see it at the moment that we can get these countries, these states, to talk about arms control seriously. But one thing that made me think about arms control was actually the push that we have seen from European countries in recent days, increasing their armament. So you might think, what is he talking about? So we see the Europeans making big announcement about increasing their armaments. They are going to talk about European deterrence, what they need more, why arms control? Because what I see happening at some point, hopefully, and here I'm optimistic, is a new arms control actor. And that's hopefully going to be Europe taking care of its own security also by means of arms control. And at some point, Europeans will have to negotiate arms control with Russia. And Russia will have to learn to take Europeans serious and negotiate arms control with them instead of only looking for the United States.
Thank you so much. I do find a lot of merit to what you're saying, and I believe behaviors are really important, and they obviously drive action or inaction. So yes, we must. The idea is that we need to break this logjam, and if this is the way to go, and there's no harm exploring um, newer avenues. uh, Thank you very much. I do appreciate the point that you made about emerging tech. I think, as Dr. Rabia Akhtar and Manpreet Sethi recently wrote in a Washington Quarterly article, that because these EDTs are likely to destabilize relations between nuclear dyads, we must look at ways to stabilize, to make them more stabilizing. And I think uh, we need to look at We need to have dialogue. We need to look at avenues or explore avenues that can kickstart conversations on and about these EDTs, because if they're allowed um, to be built up at a rapid pace, uh, we will have a big problem on our hand. But once again, I want to thank you for taking out the time to be on this podcast and to share your um, uh, insights, your thoughts, and your insightful perspectives and intellectual nows with us. Thank you so much. I look forward to engaging with you further. That's it from this episode. I will be here with another episode soon. Thank you so much.